Contest mode for Crota's End is finally over, and after thinking about how I felt about the raid, I feel like I can give my honest verdict on how the entire thing felt encounter to encounter. Of course, let me know what you guys thought about the raid in the comments below, regardless of if you attempted it on contest mode yourselves or if you watched it on a stream. First things first, my view is from somebody who attempted Crota's End for the very first time and didn't actually play in the original Destiny, so I won't be making any comparisons for the two, but we will start with the first encounter where the chalice is introduced and you have to navigate through the lanterns. The mechanic of passing the chalice around when it's charged to become enlightened is a really interesting take on promoting teamwork within a raid, as most raid mechanics don't require 3 or 4 players working together straight off the bat to do. Ad density is nice for this area as it's enough to cause an issue if they aren't dealt with, but not too overbearing for a team of 6. This encounter definitely feels like a good introduction and was probably cleared by a lot of teams, as the only real challenge is you have to get a rhythm going of passing the chalice around, and when you've got the enlightened buff you need to charge lanterns when required. At the end of the lanterns you need to guard and charge a plate to make a bridge, which is where things go from 0 to 100, which I personally really liked because it suddenly went from fast coordinated movement to a bunker defense strategy to finish it off. Overall, very good encounter with a nice mechanic to learn that promotes teamwork. Second encounter being the bridge, where the difficulty started to kick in. Defending the 3 plates on the first part was actually the easy part for my group, as we split up into 3 teams of 2 and basically had 2 people on each plate. Anti-barriers caused a bit of trouble and the sword knights were definitely something to be concerned about, but overall not difficult really. What was really good about this encounter was figuring out how to get a sword across the bridge and actually killing the first knight, because there was no way to realistically support the first sword bearer. The method we ended up using was sending a bubble titan over with the chalice along with the sword carrier to drop a bubble on top of the sword knight on the other side. That basically blinded the sword knight, and when it wasn't blind it couldn't do any damage to the sword bearer because of the overshield that the bubble gives you. Second sword being sent across was a lot easier to handle because there was already somebody over there, and that was actually a warlock with well, so popping a well down to deal with the second knight was a lot easier. The third knight was even easier, but this is where things became challenging when juggling the chalice, because 2 of us had to basically meet halfway between plates in order to transfer it, so we didn't let it charge all the way and give us enlightenment. When the 3 players who had crossed over had the plates covered on the other side, we charged the 4th person with enlightenment and send them across with the 4th sword, and utilised the tower in the back to keep the remaining 2 players safe until they could come across. When everybody was over and all the swords were deposited, it became a weird bunker defense again, and the really weird thing about this was you had to become enlightened to expunge wizards, but whether this actually directly progressed the encounter or not, I'm not exactly sure as of right now. But after the mad rush of wizards and ogres, 5 sword bearers spawned out of nowhere, and we had to grab the swords that we stashed and smash through them, and again throwing up wells and bubbles everywhere. Overall, a nice step up in difficulty that required us to think outside the box a bit to get past. Encounter 2.5, which is basically the new Thrallway, containing the deadliest enemy in all of Destiny 2, the Anteater Error Code. This thing disconnected us numerous times, and we actually reduced our loadouts to not use anything that causes AoE effects, which was a bit disappointing, but nonetheless, we powered through. Third encounter and first boss, Ute. We had 3 big problems to begin with, which was identifying a safe-ish area to charge the chalice in, the second issue was identifying which towers had the wizards in, and the third issue was labelling the towers because they were just awkwardly positioned. First solution to finding a safe-ish area was actually closer than we thought, because we utilised one of the tower rooms that you need to go through anyway in order to get the chalice. Players without the chalice would stand on top of the doors to stay out of the way of ads, so we could charge the chalice quicker, and it worked out really well because the knights didn't actually venture out towards us either. The solution for the second problem was that we actually read that there was 2 ways to identify wizards. First was using the Wish Ender Bow, which, let's be honest, Bungie doesn't make mechanics that require an exotic weapon to beat. The second way, which was probably the correct way, is that Shriekers are classed as vehicles, so the icons show up on the minimap as little red arrows that point up or down, which indicates if they are above or below you. Using that, we could pinpoint which towers didn't have Shriekers and send everybody to the right towers. But that was problem number 3. How can we send everybody to the right towers when they are all around us? We literally just labeled the rooms 1 to 7 and we picked it up that way. None of this L1, R2 nonsense. Doing damage to Ute was actually a lot easier than we anticipated. We just pretty much all threw on Thunderlords with a divinity and shredded the health. Overall, good first boss encounter where it's becoming challenging to stay alive against ads, and the boss has a good amount of health to be a challenge to overcome, but not too daunting. Final encounter, Crota. This was absolutely grueling. If you weren't getting punked by Crota, you were getting sniped by a Boomer Knight. If you could avoid that, you were getting shredded by wizards. If you could avoid that, then there was ogres. And if you could avoid that, there was a sword bearer knight sneaking up on you, or a bunch of cursed thrall. This is where my only piece of criticism will come into this raid, because I think the mages in the area is just a bit too much. Having 2 Boomer Knights in each tower is fine as a prerequisite to spawn the sword bearer, but having infinitely spawning wizards is just ridiculous. If these were put on a timer instead of where they respawn every 20 seconds after being killed, I could live with that. I do have a sneaky suspicion that you might actually be able to expunge these wizards to stop them from spawning in, at least for a damage phase anyway. But I've not actually had a chance to test that yet, and if that is the case, then the criticism that I have for this is pretty much just gone, because then there is a mechanic you can use to reduce the ads that spawn in. Apart from that, everything else is great. It's challenging to a point where you needed to run optimal builds, and everybody needed to have clearly defined roles whilst helping each other out during downtime. Crota's health was more or less perfect, because it was at a point where you had to crank out as much damage as possible for each damage phase, and even then you might not be able to beat it without getting heavy ammo back. Overall, Final Encounter was a really good challenge that pushed us to be borderline perfect with survivability and pushed the limits of build crafting to annihilate everything constantly. My final verdict on this raid is that it was very fun to do and very challenging, which for players chasing the end game of PvE content is a really good thing to do. But now I need to bring everybody back into reality. In 48 hours of contest mode, only 5,500 players managed to beat Crota's End on normal difficulty. That's approximately 917 teams that were able to beat this in 48 hours of contest mode. For context, Valor the Disciple had 892 teams beat it successfully within 24 hours of contest mode, which based on contest mode clears, this makes this raid the hardest raid that Bungie has made since the Garden of Salvation released. So I will say this, Bungie has definitely done better in terms of making the raid difficult in a good way and not just mob spam, but I need to stress that Bungie should not repeat this again for the final shape and dial back the difficulty a bit. I get that contest mode is supposed to be difficult and is basically the peak of raiding except for going for the seals, but as a game that needs to survive past the final shape, they need to make sure the raid can be beaten by many more teams. I'm not talking Root of Nightmares level of difficulty, but somewhere between this and the Deepstone Crypts level of difficulty would be a very good benchmark. But that's it for the video, thank you very much for watching, and I shall see you all in the next one.